Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of the Belonging series, which is Imperial as One's exploration into the BAME experience. And this week we're fortunate to have Harbhajan Brar, who is the head of human resources, or he's the human resources director at Imperial College. So Harbhajan, I'm going to come across to you and ask you the questions which I ask all of our guests, which is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about how you got into the position that you're currently in, but also just a bit about your journey to getting here. I think that would be really interesting.
Okay. Thank you, Wayne. In terms of journey as to how I got here, I don't think many people set out to be a HR director. It's not something that you're actually sort of start with an ambition. So a little bit about me. I'm born and brought up in West London in Southall. Went to a local comprehensive. Didn't have the best experience at the local comprehensive because it was during the time when the National Front were sort of quite active. So I became quite an active 14, 15, 16-year-old, which sort of led to the head of sixth form saying that I wouldn't be welcome there and I'd be better going to the local college. So I went to do my A-levels at the local college, did a politics and international relations degree, and did a postgraduate diploma looking at educational research. And so first job really, I started as a student placement in the London Borough of Ealing, and very quickly did a piece of research looking at the recruitment of ethnic minority teachers, which actually got published in all the national papers. And that sort of led to a complete overhaul of the recruitment processes. And so my sort of first venture into employment was sort of through research, but really looking at policy and looking at how changing policy could make a big difference. Ealing at that point had a change of political administration. It had gone from Conservative to Labour. Part of Labour's commitment was to bring in 120 new teachers. And if people know West London, they only managed to recruit 3 ethnic minority teachers out of the 120. So it really made you start questioning what's going on. From there, I sort of took on I started working in HR and really looking at the policy side of the world. Really enjoyed that sort of overhauling policies to try and get them into effectively the 20th century as it was then. And then from there, I saw a research fellow post at Warwick University advertised. I went for that, which was, the interview experience was something to remember. I've never been interviewed by 12 people around a single table, but hey, you know. Wow. But, I worked there at the Centre for Research in Ethnic Relations, where I was doing, the intention was to start my PhD, and I also got very heavily involved in sort of running their master's programs with 2 of my colleagues. So we taught on their masters. It was their MA in race and ethnic relations. So from there, just due to personal family circumstances, I came back to London and then came back into local government, where I headed up Ealing's Equalities Unit and then eventually became their head of pay and employee relations. From there, sort of decision about, you know, I sort of set myself quite an ambitious goal to try and get by the age of 30, which I didn't meet, to become a director. But I applied to become a HR director at Lewisham College. And I thought I'd go and test whether I can be a director in a small organisation. Lewisham was quite a failing college for a number of years, had sort of chewed through lots of HR directors. So interesting enough, people always used to say to me, how long are you going to be here for? I stayed there for a number of years and with great leadership, and leadership is really instrumental in all of these conversations. Actually, the college went and became the first college in the country to win 5 grade 1s in FEFC inspection reports. We were winning all the accolades, and that was, you know, had a great chief exec there called Ruth Silver. From there, then came in, went to look, the NHS looked to be an exciting place to go. Applied to Chelsea and Westminster, was politely told that actually it was one of their flagship hospitals in London and you couldn't come in there not having any NHS experience. But I mean, literally within a matter of weeks, I got a phone call saying Kingston Hospital, I've got a HRD role, we're really interested. Applied there. We were the first hospital in the country to implement Agenda for Change. We sort of led on an initiative called Improving Working Lives. And from there, I got seconded to set up what was called ICTAL, ICT Across London, which then became Connecting for Health, which is about looking at how all the different technologies could talk to each other across the NHS. Mm-hmm. From there, went to Barnet and Chase Farm, again, another failing hospital. So you'll see a pattern here. And sort of became their HR director. They were the last to implement Agenda for Change, so I had to do it twice in my life. Mm-hmm. And it was financially failing, and it had been failing for a number of years. It was a merger that should never have happened, in my opinion, but it merged. And, people always assume when if a successful hospital merges with a not so successful, somehow it'll come out as being more successful, and it didn't work out that way. Mm-hmm. At that point, the Department of Health decided to send in the big consultancy houses into failing hospitals, and we were one of those. And as they left, they sort of said that the usual standard recommendation was to put into place a turnaround director. Mm-hmm. And in all the other failing hospitals around the country, there were predominantly people from finance backgrounds. Mm-hmm. And strangely enough, PwC said that I could do it. And mm-hmm. primarily because when PwC were trying to find the savings, they sort of found 12 or 13 million. And I sort of said to them, I think I can find 16 or 17. Mm-hmm. Never say these things because actually they come and haunt you. So the trust appointed me as their turnaround director. And the Department of Health, in its usual way, wanted a 1-year turnaround plan with an organisation that had been failing 8 or 10 years. And I said, no, I'll give you a 2-year turnaround plan. I'll go on to a fixed term contract. If I've not achieved turnaround, I'm happy to be moved on. Mm-hmm. And after about 18, 19 months, we achieved financial balance, and we also hit our clinical targets. And for me, the reason why I enjoyed the turnaround, for me, it was a culture piece. It was an OD piece, because mm-hmm. it's easy to find money. You can shut mm-hmm. the place down and it'll break mm-hmm. even. Mm-hmm. There are patients to serve, etc. Then you sort of think, where do you want to go there? PwC kindly offered me a directorship, but they were going to send me all over the country, and I had a young family, and it's not something I wanted to do. So I then applied to become a HR director in the civil service, because the civil service were trying to modernise HR, and you apply to grade in the civil service, you don't apply to role. Right, so okay. You go through quite a rigorous assessment process, and then you're asked in terms of where do you want to go and work. I didn't say the Department of Health, but they sort of said to me, with your experience, we think you'd be better served in the department. Yeah. Did that for a number of years. And then I tend to do 3-4 years, and I have a belief that if I can't make an impact, so this will be my challenge here as well, then I'm not going to make an impact. So I started looking at the private sector, because I always wanted to see whether I could work in the private sector. There's always this view about the private sector is difficult. It's more complex. So I applied I started to work for a company called Sodexo. Mm-hmm. And I was their HR director for all their central functions, so legal, finance, HR, but also their justice business. Mm-hmm. I think I stayed there about 6 years. We successfully mobilised a public sector prison into the private sector. We won a quarter of all the probation contracts in the country. It was worth about £1 billion worth of win over the length of the contract. They were long contracts, they were 20-odd year contracts. Yeah. But for me, it was nice because actually the perception was always public sector people are risk averse. They're not creative, and actually the team that I worked with, it was the biggest set of wins that the company had ever had. So they were phenomenal. I then, after a number of years, decided I was going to set up to set up a consultancy. Yeah. So I'd set my business up, etc. And within about 2 or 3 weeks of just sort of finishing off, getting my business cards, starting to think about setting a website up, I got a call from the new chief exec at St George's Hospital, which is in South London. It's a major trauma centre. It's one of the, it is one of the teaching hospitals. But they had gone through a really bad CQC report and were described as what was called inadequate. And so that led to the whole of the senior team being removed. So all the non-execs as well as the exec director. So you had a new chief exec appointed, who I had worked with in Barnet and Chase Farm, who sort of said, come and help me pull a new senior team together. So I'd gone there for 2-3 months, I think, and 3 and a bit years later, I was still there. Wow. We had gone from being inadequate to requires improvement, which is the next level up. Yeah. We'd started with a £90 million deficit, and we were bringing that down rapidly. So we thought we were going to get to around the 10 or 11 million, and then COVID kicked in. Reason that just prior to COVID, I saw the Imperial job, and I thought, actually, here's an organisation that's really stable, great reputation. So I applied for it, went through the process, and then COVID hit. And so my intentions to start, when I was intending to sort of got delayed. I spoke to Alice and Ian, and they sort of said, no, Harbhajan, actually stay in the NHS. And at George's, we stepped up our ITU capacity at a phenomenal pace. We've gone from 60 beds to having over 200 beds. Lots of pressure from, the Nightingale hospitals to provide staff there, and sort of lots of politics in that space. So that's me in terms of career pathway. A couple of things I'd always say in there is my first ever boss at London Borough of Ealing was a guy called Kwame Akufu. And he was phenomenal in terms of helping me all the way through my career path. He was the assistant director of HR, and literally through all my career, he would be the person I would go and talk to if I was thinking of making a move. And he would be very, very honest about in terms of advice, in terms of guidance. Sadly, he passed away a little while ago, so that was most probably the hardest thing for me, because we became family friends. I've attended, all of his kids' weddings, and they're in and out of our house. But actually, having that mentor and that support has been phenomenal. The other part around the Belonging series is I've always found that actually, when I've gone into the Department of Health or I've gone into the NHS, there weren't many people like me. There were very, very few people of a BAME background there, and that's really sometimes quite lonely and quite hard. Because actually there's a lot on your shoulders, in the sense of, actually, if you fell, people say, see, he was only appointed because he's an ethnic minority, because they were just trying to get the numbers up. Yeah. So they're hard conversations. Yeah. So if that's a very, very quick cook's tour through my working career. And
that was I'm still trying to jot down all of the different sectors that you've been in, and the range of different experiences. And I suppose, in the idea of looking at a belonging, for one, it never seems that you stay in one place for a long period of time. So I don't know if that says anything about the notion of belonging. But it also says that, from your description, every time you've gone in there with a purpose. And it seems to me that within the time frame which you're there, so it's like an impactful timetable. You say, I've got a 3-year program, I've got a 4-year program, and you're quite determined at achieving your goal within that time frame. Where does that kind of visionary approach come from, if I could ask that?
I mean, the belonging part is really interesting, because that comes from family. That comes from my parents migrated here from Singapore. Right. My parents were are Sikhs. My dad sadly passed away. And actually, my father was in the police force during the war in Singapore. So, lots of family members. And he has moved around the world in terms of sort of looking after family, looking after, making sure he does the best for, he did everything to make sure that actually we didn't want for anything. They were working class parents. My mum worked at, we used to joke, my father works in the city, but my father worked night shifts as a cleaner in the city. That was my father's, that was the experience we grew up with. Yeah. The belonging piece is really, really important, because actually I'm a Sikh who wears a turban. I'm not a baptized Sikh. So I'm, lots of people would say I'm not necessarily a good Sikh, but actually the identity is in my name. It's in the way I look. And it's interesting, I grew up through school where friends were cutting their hair because they weren't getting jobs, or they were not, their need to belong was almost driven by trying to look the same, or
Right. Okay.
you know, you sort of you shorten your name. You know, I have nicknames. Family, I'm sure, have lots of nicknames for me, but actually, my name is important to me, and so belonging is really, really about how you drive some of that belonging. For me, I don't have necessarily a belonging to the organisation. I have a belonging to the public sector, because I've come back in there. I think what we do is really important. I've always tried to do voluntary work all my life. So, for example, every Monday, if you go to Trafalgar Square, you'll see me feeding homeless with a group of colleagues, and we've been doing that all the way through COVID. I've been, you know, magistrate was something that was important to me, so I became a magistrate. I had to step back for a little while, because when I worked in justice, you couldn't be running prisons and be sentencing people to prisons. You know, slight conflict of interest. But you know, I've spoken to Ian about getting back into that, and so and he's very, very supportive. So belonging is about it's something that's in here, really. You know, and for me, part of it is I'm driven because actually some of the agendas I want to drive are about actually, I don't want my daughter and, you know, friends and colleagues, people to experience some of the things I've experienced through my working life.
So it's interesting. You've said that you're very driven, right? And that your belonging, that sense of belonging, you alluded to your father and his passion to ensure that you had everything that you wanted. How has that then translated into this community-minded spirit that you have developed, and that idea that it's almost like you're saying that you belong within the community because of the way that you respond to the community? So it's very much tied together, if I'm getting that right.
Yeah, it is, and it's I mean, it's interesting because it's a bit like culture. There isn't one static view of culture, so you evolve over a period of time, you know, actually. And, you know, we had the conversation when we were on the Black Lives Matter about matters, you know, in the sense of you don't want to necessarily be pigeonholed into a box. A little title doesn't actually reflect who you are as an individual. I mean, belonging for me is quite often about family. It's about the people around me. It's a respect that, you know, I can give people and they'll give me back. But, you know, quite often you spend your life, and it's interesting, you know, this sort of really does make you think, you know, I spent my life where, you know, people would say, you know, get out of my country and call me all sorts of different names. And I you know, I'm 56, and it's, you know, and some of it I would say I proactively encouraged, in the sense I didn't have any problem if there was a National Front meeting in East London, I'd go there and try and break, you know. And so there were some things that sometimes, you know, but you know, part and parcel of it is belonging is an interesting concept, because actually I go to India and people always, I'm Indian, you know, I'm of an Indian heritage. I'm an outsider there. They can smell me as an outsider there, which is really fascinating. You know, they will automatically say to me, where are you from, England or Canada? Because that's where the two largest communities are. And I'd say, no, I'm from Punjab, and you can't, you know, no matter what I try and do, I can't, you know. So belonging is an interesting thing. I don't think it's not grounded in geography for me.
Yeah, I understand that. So if it's not grounded in geography, you definitely said it's grounded in your family values, the values which you hold, and the values which you hope your family, your daughter and such like would also take on. So, and then you also said that it's not a situation of you feeling that you have to belong within an organization. Okay, so to me, it sounds more of an inner self, inner self-belief, an inner self. As long as you're happy within yourself, it doesn't matter which situation you find yourself, you can make it that you will belong. Am I along the right tracks, or am I going off at a tangent?
I think you are, to a certain degree. I mean, belonging in an organisation is an interesting concept. You know, most people who've line managed me and who have worked with me, they will know. You know, I always say to people, if you're looking for the yes HR director who will do anything for you, irrespective of boundaries, I'm not it. Because I'm happy to, you know, there'll be moments when I will have arguments with anybody, because actually there are boundaries that I'm not prepared to cross. you know, I have loyalty to the organisation. You know, I'm very,
Mm-hmm.
very loyal to Imperial, and I will
Mm-hmm.
make sure we try and do the right things. But if
Mm-hmm.
Imperial is going in a direction that doesn't work with me, then that's the point when I have to think, you know,
Mm-hmm.
is Imperial right for me? And I've done that with a lot of, with the organisations I work with. So, and that's a hard call, and it's easier for me to do that. I'm 56. I'm about, you know, so for me, you could say I'm actually at the tail end of my career, and so, you know, actually, you know, and I've been lucky in the sense I've been a HR director for sort of 24, 25 years, and you know, it's been a, you know, it's been a good career for me. I've really enjoyed it. But, you know, I have no hesitation. You know, it's interesting. There's been the piece in, you know, one of the American bankers saying actually there wasn't the ethnic minority black talent coming through. That's nonsense.
Yeah.
And so, you know, for me, it's interesting. So when for example, the Department of Health about, when the NHSIE put an announcement out, this is our top 18 team, you know, and I came home, I was incensed by it. And so I wrote a note to Dido Harding, and I said, you know, imagine what the 400,000 ethnic minority staff in the NHS feel when you've made your announcement that your top 400,000 people are, the leaders of all of those are all white.
Yeah. That's a very...
I then had to go and say to my chief exec and my chairman, I've just written this, you better know, because there's going to be flack coming from it. Yeah. And they were brilliant because they've been great and supportive, and they said we would have been happy if you wrote it on George's paper.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, she and I got into a really interesting argument about talent.
Yeah.
And she took a bit of that approach and said, Harbhajan, that, you know, I said to her, there are 9 HR directors in the NHS. Did you speak to a single one of them?
Yeah.
About talent.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, it's interesting because the individual in the States who made that statement has been jumped upon, and I think rightly so. Yeah. Hopefully politely, because actually, imagine how the staff in that organisation feel. Yeah. Imagine how, you know, so there are things that we do need to be thinking about in terms of how we challenge. And that old stereotype that there aren't people out there, that started from when I did the very first piece of work in Ealing. Yeah. When they only appointed 2 or 3 ethnic minority teachers. You know what they did? They went and recruited at every rural university. They didn't go to any of the London universities or big city universities. Hey, what do you expect the outcome to be? Yeah. You know, so some of these things have been ongoing for a long, long time. Yeah.
So you see talent where you look for talent, if that's a way of putting it. So if you don't go looking for talent within specific communities, for example, then you're not going to see that talent if you're not giving them the same level of opportunities.
It's also how we measure talent.
Okay.
You know, I'll go back to my father. My father never went to school. Right. But he spoke 11 languages.
Wow.
Because what he did was you know, actually wherever he worked, you know, for him being able to communicate was quite a key part of the conversation. So we also have a very, very rigid view about what's talent. Yeah. You know, and it's interesting because Kwame and I always used to talk about this in Ealing. It's as ethnic minorities, how do we quite often compensate? We go and become overqualified. We used to joke about it. The sheer numbers of masters amongst the ethnic minority staff in London Borough of Ealing outweighed the rest of the staff component. You know, just from that small group, because you know, if you and sometimes the difficult conversations is people would say, but and I've got a master's and I've got a doctorate and I'm not getting a job. It's a number of different factors in the equation, but that's how often we you know, for me, I grab any opportunity I can for learning, and you sort of stick that, you know, and so you add to that to the CV. But talent is going to be one of the biggest issues that every organisation is going to have to really rethink about. How do we evaluate that? How do we measure that? And then how do we nurture that to be able to be, you know, I've been lucky in the sense I've had very, very good people around me who have guided me. And sometimes it's finding that right guide is also really, really important.
I was just about to ask you that question. What was it that you feel made the difference for yourself? Because as you've just alluded to, that within the BAME community, within Blacks, ethnic minorities, there is emphasis of education and getting the qualifications. So what is it that set you apart to enable you to make the steps to get to the positions where you have been in, which others seem to be having glass ceilings placed at every level when they're trying to make that progression. What do you think is the difference?
If I genuinely knew the answer, I'd bottle it and share it. I think for me, I think luck has got to come into play to a certain degree. Having the right people around me to support me and nurture me. I think, I'd hope over a period of time, actually, you build a CV, so you build a track record where it's actually based on, there are tangibles I can point to. I think it's a mixture of many different things. It's also about honesty, because I can tell you, Kwame quite often used to, I used to get into, in your 20s, you want to fight every battle. I'm now getting maturer, and I sort of think, actually, be a bit more careful about the battles you take on. And so part and parcel of it, it's the guidance you get around you. It has been difficult. First time I went to the NHS and we went to an NHS conference, I looked around the room, there were 300 odd people in the room, and I thought, I can't see a single ethnic minority at my level. What's going on? There were a few, but there was a big auditorium, and I'd not met them. I mean, we're also not as good as around networking, around where opportunities come up, etc. So we need to do a little bit more around that. I'd hope I've never used a network to be able to land a job, because people always say, who do you know at Imperial, or who do you know at the DH or anything? And in a strange way, my networks aren't at that level. They're not people I necessarily mix with, but we do need to be supporting each other.
Right.
And to be constantly, saying, how do we as a community sort of pull each other along, rather than the worst thing would be is for me to just sort of say, I've got to the top, I can kick the ladder away, and everybody else, that would be horrific for me.
But that goes against what you have been saying from the very outset, because you seem to be very community minded. So for me, that would never even enter your psyche to say that I've got here, I'm not going to enable anybody else to get to where I would be. How can we become more proactive at, one, identifying the talent, and two, ensuring that that talent is given the opportunity to progress? Because I think, based on what you've said, Kwame has been very influential in either helping give you the counsel or setting you, kind of like helping you to identify which battles you need to. So what advice would give on that?
I think one of the things that we need to do, and certainly it's something that we need to think about in an Imperial, and it's interesting because, do we have a talent map? And the simple answer is not something that I can easily lay my hands on. Now, within each faculty, etc., there are views around who the talent are, but somehow we need to find a way of capturing that. We then need to look at, actually, what do we need to do in order for, if the talent's sitting at one level below, what are the things we need to do to support them to be able to get to the next level? So things like coaching around mentoring, reverse mentoring, for you to be able to be sort of sat next to Ian or Alice or people like myself, just to be able to get that degree of experience. It's also about actually making sure that we all market ourselves properly in terms of, LinkedIn profiles, sharing of CVs amongst each other. Part and parcel of it is finding a mechanism to be able to identify that talent, because otherwise we give every organisation the excuse to say the talent's not out there.
Yeah.
And that for me is just not something we should be doing.
Yeah.
So one of the tasks that sits with me as the HR director is to find a way of doing that, but it's got to be fairly honest and transparent as well. Yeah. So fundamentally, what you shouldn't do is say to somebody you're talented when they're not going to make it to the next level.
Right.
So again, the conversations need to be fairly, but this is something that I'd be wanting to try and get as much input in terms of sort of seeing what have we currently got. Networks like these are really fundamental as well, because actually as a community we support each other. And I can remember setting up what was called black sections in Nalgo, so I'm going to give my age away, which is now Unison. And the unions were really up in arms with us, sort of saying, this is outrageous.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're trade unionists, we can't be racist. And I sort of said to them, look at the top of the union.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That should speak volumes. Look at all your full-time officials, that should speak volumes. So there is something inherently not right there either.
Mm-hmm.
But actually the collective component of it is quite important. You know, if I see a really great job, how do I get it to the people I know in my network?
Yeah.
And it's simple things like that that I think we'll need to have these conversations about. Do I have the answers? No.
Yeah.
I've got some experience of tools that I've used in the past, which I'm going to try and bring in.
Yeah.
I think, you know, we all talk about things like culture and values, and there is a lot of work going around the sort of whole diversity agenda, and we need to support that. Because, you know, things like being able to measure actually helps to drive some of the conversation. So I'm very, very keen that we do more work in that space. We also need to be thinking around, you know, how do we look after each other? So the sort of things like the well-being agenda for me is really important, and you'll really help me. You'll hear me sort of bang on about it on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Because actually, how do we just even simply reach out amongst ourselves and say, "You okay?"
Yeah, that's a very good question. Very good. I'm going to follow up on something which you said, and then I'm going to open up, because I can see people are sending me questions. So I'm going to ask them to ask you a few questions as well. But I just wanted to ask this final question, which was, how have you negotiated the pushback that you're in a position and people have kind of said, well, why is he in that position? Why is he being given special treatment or anything like that? Because I know once we start talking about issues related to Black and Asians and ethnic minorities, there's always the pushback as, why do they need it? Have you encountered that? And if so, what have you done to alleviate that?
You always do this through stories, don't you? And so when I joined the Department of Health, one of my senior HR managers, who I'm still in touch with, sort of said to me, you know, she said to me completely without thinking, and she said to me, you do know the only reason you've been appointed is because actually all of the senior management team at the department are all white. And I sort of said to her, I said, thank you for, I said, that's how you feel. I said, so you just completely written off my experience, my qualifications in terms of what I've delivered, and you think I've just solely been appointed because of my ethnicity. Interesting enough, when I left DH, we went out for a drink, and I sort of said to her, do you remember that statement? She was horrified. She goes, oh my God, I didn't say that. I said, I don't mind you saying that, because actually, for me, it's about having the conversation. The issue about, this is not about what, if people are saying to us that actually this is about special privilege, or you're doing something for this community and not for others, actually, we haven't yet got the narrative right to explain to those individuals. Actually, you know, I always say to people, you know, say to a lot of my senior colleagues, and if I looked at in DH, for example, or in the civil service, the vast majority of them went to Oxford, Cambridge. So their networks were those networks. I wasn't in those networks. Lots of other people like us don't get into those networks. So those networks help. So what we're trying to do is redress some of that. It's not about anything over and above. I never want to get a job because of my ethnicity. I want to get the job because I'm the best there is in that space. I hope that's how I've always got it. I don't know what goes through the mind of other people. But the key to this is that if in London, and we're in London, you know, if in London you're going to fish in a narrow pond, you're going to get a smaller fish. If you're going to actually look at all the talent out there, your chances of you being able to actually snag a bigger fish is just obvious. So, you know, if you're going to go in there with a very blinkered view, and your processes will say that actually we only want a particular person of a particular type, then your ability to be able to actually bring new ideas, innovation, difference in, is the bit where it's going to be difficult.
Definitely. I'm going to ask Elizabeth, because she sent a couple of questions. So Elizabeth, if you want to ask any one of the multiple questions which you've sent through, then that would be really useful. And then Sunday, I'll line you up next after Elizabeth, please. Elizabeth? So, all right, I'll ask it on Elizabeth's behalf. And one of the questions which she asked is, for some, it feels like we have a ragged trousers philanthropy approach to BAME at Imperial. What do you feel about this? So a ragged trousers philanthropy. So I'm assuming that what she's saying is that there's not much being actually offered in reality. So how could we address that? Okay, she doesn't have access to a microphone.
I'm not sure I necessarily buy into the ragged trousers analogy. So let's start there.
Okay.
For me, I think what we need to do is understand what we've currently got in place,
Mm-hmm.
and to then see what we can build upon. Let me do you a simple comparator. George's employed 9,400 staff. When I arrived there, they didn't even have a single person doing any work around diversity and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
I had to make the business case to start that whole process from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
I got one post. Here we've got a team, we've got a website, we've got, and with lots of initiatives going on
Mm-hmm.
around there. So actually, sometimes it feels as though we're not doing lots.
Mm.
Inevitably, we could do more.
Mm-hmm.
So there's going to be a piece around that. I think the commitment of the organisation is incredibly strong, and if you can get committed people at the top of the organisation, you can start moving things, I think.
Mm-hmm.
For me, inevitably, the worry will be is whether what we put into place is sustainable, it's long term. Yeah. So they're the bits that I would be more anxious about. The desire for change amongst BAME staff is whether it's in the 60s, 70s, 80s, now, has always been there, and we're always impatient that we're not moving fast enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll have to say, I'm sure at Imperial we're not moving fast enough.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be constantly using the group to be able to sort of try and hold people to account, to be able to challenge those conversations. So, and, what's gone on in the States has in part sort of driven a number of organisations to start moving on that. My worry about that is the George Floyd stuff will go off the agenda and then something else goes in there.
Yeah.
It's our job not to let it go off that agenda.
Yeah.
It's our job to keep reminding people that actually in London, as a BAME community, we are pretty close to 30–40% of the population.
Yeah.
And, to not serve the needs of that population, I think, is just an incredible injustice.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd agree with that, definitely. Sunday, would you like to ask your question, please?
Right, thank you very much. Thank you for that. Sharing your part of your life with us was very interesting. I actually have 3 questions, but I'm going to ask you 2 now because I don't want the last one to be. I don't want the last one to be recorded. Right. The first one, you said earlier that people have different definition of talent, which is good, and I totally agree with that. And also, identifying this talent is a big issue, and this is very common within Imperial College as well. So as an HR director, what are you going to change? How are you going to change this narrative to make sure we start to identify these? It doesn't even have to be BAME. I've seen some of my white colleagues as well, where their talent has not been identified, and they get really, really cheesed up because somebody else, doing half of the things they're doing, and they seems to be moving on in life. So that's the first question. The second question, you said that you worked in St. George's, which is I used to live very close to St. George's many, many years ago. Was there equivalent of Imperial's one established in St. George's? And there is, what things have you done for them, or that really highlight your role as the HR director at the time that really helped them? The reason why I'm asking this, I want to try and evaluate what you're going to do for Imperial's one going forward.
I'm gonna have my appraisal done by committee now, obviously. So cheers, thank you very much. Are we going to change the narrative? I hope so. I mean, you know, I'm certainly going to try my damnedest, and actually I can see that, you know, there are, you know, Susan from my team's there, and she's absolutely committed to be able to try and move that agenda. So we're going to keep the momentum going to be able to, you know, we say we are a world-class university. We've got to have a world-class HR process. In order to be able to attract the world-class talent, we've got to find the tools to be able to identify that. And that includes looking at our own talent as well. And so part and parcel of that is that's something we're going to have to do. So are we going to change the narrative? I hope so. I'm happy to come back here every so often and for you to tell me that Harbhajan, it hasn't moved fast enough or it hasn't moved quickly enough. You know, I have no qualms about having some of these conversations. Second question, George's. George's did not, surprisingly enough, so I left George's, what, 4 months ago? It was only about 2 years ago that we actually managed to get staff networks off the ground. And part and parcel of it, for me, is it needed, there were two bits that fundamentally that I've noticed when we set up staff networks. Quite often they start where we actually start, and I say we because I've been involved in those. We spend an inordinate amount of time navel gazing and saying everything that's wrong and talking about our own experiences, which is really important. But then it's about how do you turn that strength of collective into being able to challenge the organisation, and that's where the power starts coming through. For me, the reason I think it didn't work at George's in the past is the leadership commitment wasn't there. So what we did was we put an exec director, in fact we put 2 exec directors as co-sponsors who would then have to report back to the board in terms of key issues. So the group had direct access to the board, which is quite a powerful way of doing that, and they would report back. Inevitably the issues get in about how much time and support can we give, and that becomes a resource type issue. I think where that group absolutely came into their own was during COVID. And at George's, it was horrible because we had a number of deaths, and all of our deaths, which were COVID related, were ethnic minority staff. And getting the senior team to meet with the Bain group was incredibly powerful because actually they talked about how their treatment was different in terms of the access to equipment was different. That was the most eye-opening moment for some of my most senior colleagues, because they just did not believe that actually that would be happening down there in terms of on the front line. So there is real power and support in terms of being able to change the organisation. I think there are 2 roles for a group like this. It's about how you support each other, we support each other. So it's about being able to sort of use each other as a sounding board, but it's then also sort of very, very carefully thinking about where you want to put the challenges against the college leadership in terms of constantly pushing them about the things that they want to move on. I'm also fascinated in your third question, which you don't want to get recorded. Is that because you don't want to record it or you don't want my answer recorded? Well, you can send that to me separately.
We'll have our after party, and I'm sure Sunday will share that during the after party, right? So.
I'm just saving the best to the last.
Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to make your point, which you made on about talent and where we look for talent.
Yeah, it was just really backing up what Harbhajan and Sunday had said. Sunday said in the comments as well about how I'd been to a previous talk, and it was actually from an ex-footballer, and talking about looking for talent. And in football, we all know that, yes, now all the big clubs and the smaller clubs have these football academies. And so that's where they're getting the best of the best. They get people from all around the world and bring them here to be, try and raise them up to be part of the first team eventually. But they also still have their scouts, and they send them to the local Sunday leagues to see who they've missed. And when they get a talent from the Sunday league, they're not thought of as less than football players. If their talent has been spotted and they're good enough, it means they're good enough to be in the top football teams. And that's the kind of thing that's missing, I think, in academia and other industries, to see that just because they're not coming from what is thought of as the best route in, it's looking at all different channels to make sure you're picking up everyone in different ways.
Sarah, it's a really, really interesting question, because actually we get quite obsessed. I can remember having a conversation years and years ago where one of our senior managers, this was in local government, had actually on the person spec said must be Oxford or Cambridge. So I sort of said to him, why? And we got into that really interesting conversation, because that's where the best go. And I said, based on your assumptions. But the difficulty around this is actually that was a job that you didn't even need to be a graduate. And it took me a couple of years to convince the individual, lose the graduate requirement and see the different pool of talent you're going to get. If you stay with Oxford and Cambridge, because he went to Oxford or Cambridge, I don't know which one, you are going to continue to get more people in the same vein. Oxford and Cambridge are brilliant universities, but actually you need to be thinking about where you actually access your talent. And the issue about the football example in the chat is a really, really fascinating one, because football club doesn't care where you went to. If you're the best football player, they're going to nab you and they're going to put you under contract and they're going to bring you through their individual academy. What we need to be able to do is, how do we identify the best talent? And it mustn't be constrained by coming from a particular background or coming from a particular education or coming from, and that's the bit sometimes we get into some real difficulties. I can remember doing an open day it was at Kingston Hospital, and it's really interesting because Kingston Hospital is in very leafy sort of middle class suburbia, and they used to say we can't get healthcare assistance. And I used to say, well, Southall and Hounslow are 3-4 miles away. Let's go and advertise there. Oh, we don't want to upset the local hospitals there. And I said, well, I don't particularly care. Actually, it's about getting people in there. And on one of the open days, somebody came to me and she goes, would you employ me? And it was just one of these things. I'm thinking, what a strange question. You're at an open day, you're asking me. And she had visible disabilities. It did not occur to me that that's the question she was asking me. And so we got into a conversation and she sort of said to me, I apply for jobs, I get there and people see me, then think actually the kids on the wards, etc., are going to be frightened of those visible disabilities. And I said, actually, a lot of those kids will, they are also struggling with issues. And actually, that's the sort of person, I want somebody who looks like those kids as well as, and it just didn't occur to me. So this is my blinkered visions. But part and parcel about it is about, how do you measure and how do you actually engage the breadth of the talent out there? There are lots of people who've never been to school, but who are just absolutely brilliant at what they do. So, do we just measure talent by a particularly very narrow definition? I mean, they're the conversations I think we're going to have to get into. It's also who does the assessing of that talent.
Yeah, definitely. I've got one more question. Thanks for your question, Sarah and Sunday. Moonlee, I'm going to let you have the question, please, if you can, and then I'll finish off. Thanks.
Thanks, Wayne. So there's kind of like two questions for you. Like, how can we ensure that our managers and leaders, the people that make decisions at Imperial, making sure they're on the same page as you are? Because I have seen some, and they don't see it as like a tick boxing exercise. And the second question is like, as a HR practitioner, do you feel that the HR field, the wider fields, not just higher education or Imperial, is actually equipped to deal with diversity issues? Because sometimes what I've seen in textbooks is like they don't deal it in much depth, and sometimes superficially as well. That's my question.
Yeah, there are two bits, so I'll sort of pick up sort of the first bit in terms of how do we ensure that our managers and leaders are on the same page. Part of it is, for example, we've been doing a piece of work around the whole culture and values, and it's been sort of very much bottom-up driven. I think Susan will give me precise numbers, but I think about 20 or 30% of Imperial staff have sort of contributed to, or certainly over 10 have contributed to actually setting those. Then the issue is about actually, how do we embed those? How do we make sure that people live those? And so, you know, there are a number of things we will need to look at. One of the pieces of work that we've kicked off is around, you know, what are the basic bits of training that every manager must go through? So, you know, we're looking at core training, mandatory training. You know, we quite often assume that actually you become a manager, you pick up your managerial skills through osmosis. Some people may be brilliant at doing that, but other people need, you know, some basics and some fundamentals. So part of it is about making sure that we equip people. We also need to equip them with the vision that we're working to, so everybody's pulling in that same direction. Will it happen overnight? We also need to challenge some of those leaders, and we need to call them out as well. And so that is not an easy thing for lots of people, to be able to do, especially if you're more junior. You know, in the NHS, people used to say to me, certainly, you know, junior doctors used to say, I can't call the consultant out because actually they're going to be the one who's going to make a difference as to where my next move is, what my career is. That culturally is wrong. And so we need to be thinking about that. In terms of HR, are they equipped to deal with it? I'd say yes and no. It really does depend on a lot of the individuals. Do we, through our formal programs in terms of how we teach our HR practitioners, cover these topics? We're getting better. I mean, interesting enough, I worked in local government, and I used to moan about the people who were doing the IPD courses coming back to Ealing and sort of giving me quite a textbook answer, which actually wasn't grounded in the reality of a working environment. And in the end, IPD got so fed up with me constantly pushing, and they said, come and become an external examiner. So I did that for a number of years. But part of it was actually about how do you take the sort of the theory and the praxis type stuff, and sort of link the two together. HR is most probably not the loved profession in any organisation you can go to. Let's be honest about it. Because as individual employees, they will always tell me HR are on the side of managers. And managers will always tell me HR are always taking the side of the individual employee. And every organisation we've gone to, people have said to me, what's wrong with HR? And it hasn't been any different here as well. So there's a journey to go for all of us.
Harbhajan,
yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're kind of like out of time. We've gone slightly over, but that's brilliant. You've been really candid and frank with us today, and I really want to say thank you for that. I do always ask this question. It is a standard stock question. What advice would you give to your younger self, them starting out, possibly wanting to become a HR director or whatever, or not even just a HR director, just how they can make it to the top echelons, to have that seat at the top table? What advice would you give to them?
I think I've given part of that advice. Find people around you who you can talk to, who you can trust. You know, personally, I would say don't be so driven. So maybe from my point of view, I think, you know, sometimes I think my drive occasionally has potentially, have I given enough time to my daughter and my family? Possibly, I genuinely don't know. I mean, I've tried to get that balance right. You know, for me, I always quite often set the bar high. I mean, if we were in a training room, I'd say to everybody, put your hand up as high as it can go. And people will do that. And you can see, I mean, I'm on camera and I do that. And then about 30 seconds, I say to them, put it a little higher. And everybody manages to do that. So the question is, how do you get to that conversation where you set the bar at the appropriate level? Because if you just set it there, then that's where you're going to go to. Actually push yourself, but, you know, put some, you know, there's an inherent danger if you set it too high, you're going to be disappointed. But it's interesting because when I do career coaching with people, I always sort of say, where is it you're trying to get to? Let's work backwards from that. And that may be something that's, it's you know, I'd said to you sort of fairly flippantly, I wanted to be a HR director at 30. It was a high bar. I didn't manage to do the stretch on it immediately, but actually it was quite well, for me, I tried to plan it, you know, there was no way my first job was going to be a HR director for 9,000 staff. So I went to a place which actually had 560 odd staff. So, you know, so part and parcel about it is about how you plan your journey.
So good strategic planning and set your bar high. Set your bar where you want it to be, okay? Have a plan as to how you're going to get there, and find the people around you who can help you to get to where you want to be.
And it's also, I mean, when I first joined the NHS, people said to me, why aren't you going for a chief exec role? And it's been asked of me several times. And I used to say to them, actually, the NHS treats its chief execs very badly. The shelf life of an NHS chief exec is incredibly short.
Yeah.
So actually, I don't want to be at the receiving end of that. I'd rather be at the receiving end of everybody telling me how bad HR is. But that's, you know, some of those conversations are actually quite important in terms of how you sort of think about. So, you know, I've thoroughly enjoyed wherever I've been, because actually part and parcel of it. I move around because friends will say to me is, if I don't have enough to do, I'm dangerous. I go find things to do. So maybe that's why I move, because then I start a new challenge and that preoccupies me. But, you know, this Imperial will be my last big challenge.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. We'll see. Never say never. I think that was a movie, wasn't it? But so, Harbhajan, thank you very much for your insight. It really has been brilliant having you on. And from the responses, I can see that everyone else has also enjoyed it as well. So I'm going to just advertise for next week, in which case for next week, we're going to be having Professor Washington Ochen, who is, the co-director of the Institute of Security and Science and Technology at Imperial College, but he's also the first Black professor at Imperial College. So I think it's going to be a real joy and an insight to hear his story and his experiences of excellence at the highest level. So tune in next week for that. And if you have missed any of the Belonging series, you can get them on at this HTTP. It's on YouTube, this tiny URL, Belonging IOA. So if you haven't seen them all, this one will be uploaded within the next couple of days. And I just want to encourage you to have a look and think about what it is for us to belong. Harbhajan, once again, I want to just say thank you very much. And I'll see everyone again next week, Friday at 12:30. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody. And it was a real privilege and a pleasure talking to you. So, you know, and it will be really good to keep some of these conversations ongoing.
Definitely. Thanks very much.
Don't disconnect yet. Tell him not to disconnect.
No,
yet.
he's not.